All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive takes us back to ancient Israel, specifically to the period of the exiles. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover today, from those epic historical narratives you find in Kings and Samuel to, well, the warnings and prophecies of Jeremiah.
Mm.
Oh, and we can't forget those tricky theological questions about covenants,
Yeah.
right?
It's a bit like we're piecing together one of those giant historical jigsaw puzzles, but this one has like these profound implications, right, for understanding, the whole relationship between like an entire people and their God.
Exactly. By the end of this deep dive, you'll not only get why those exiles happen, but like what they tell us about how faith can survive anything, and how religious practices change over time, and maybe even some insights you can apply to your own life. You never know.
And, a lot of people, they hear covenant and they think it's like just a fancy word for contract, right? But not in this context. We're talking about this sacred pact, right, between God and the Israelites. And it's a promise with like layers and layers of meaning and consequences. We'll get to all that.
So to really get this, we got to rewind a bit first.
Yeah.
Think of the Israelite kingdoms, right? You've got Israel up north and Judah in the south, kind of like two branches of the same family tree, each with their own kings, their own stuff going on, sometimes even fighting each other.
And kind of like looming over all that family drama is God's covenant with King David, that promise of an everlasting dynasty. But, we'll see how that promise gets kind of put to the test in some pretty unexpected ways.
Yeah, this is where our deep dive gets really interesting. So it's 722 BC, and Samaria, that's the capital of the northern kingdom, Israel, right? Well, it falls to the Assyrians. And get this wasn't some quick invasion. We're talking a siege that lasted 3 whole years. Longer than, like, some of those shows you binge watch. Really shows you how determined the Assyrians were and how hard the Israelites must have fought back.
And what they did after they conquered it, that's even more, like, significant. It wasn't just about taking the land. It was about, like, dismantling an entire culture. They deported, huge numbers of Israelites, sending them all over their empire. And then they brought in people from other places they had conquered and, like, settled them in those empty Israelite cities.
Wow. It's hard to even imagine the kind of cultural and religious mixing that must have created. Can you imagine being taken from your home and then just having to learn to live in a completely different place with people who have different beliefs and customs and everything? Must have been chaotic.
Oh, it was more than chaotic. It was like intentional, right? They wanted to erase the Israelites' identity, assimilate them into this big, messy Assyrian kind of melting pot. And you know what? It actually had some unexpected results. That's how you got groups like the Samaritans who, like, they held on to their own version of Israelite beliefs, even though they were living right alongside all these other people from, like, all over the place.
So even when someone tries to wipe out your culture, your identity can still, like, find a way to survive. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. But what do the sources say about why this exile happened in the first place? Was it, like, just because the Assyrians were so powerful? Or was there more to it?
Well, Kings and Samuel are pretty clear on that. They say the Israelites' downfall was, basically because they kept turning away from God, the God who made that covenant with David. They started worshiping other gods, doing things that, like, went against their agreement, and, they kind of broke the terms of the deal.
So it's like they kept pushing the boundaries of that covenant, like seeing how far they could go, and then boom, they got hit with the consequences.
Right. The Assyrian exile, it was devastating, yeah, but it was also, like, a wake-up call, right? A direct result of their choices.
And then just over 100 years later, bang, we get to the Babylonian exile of Judah in 586 BC. And this time, it gets even more intense.
Definitely more intense. Because now we're not talking about just a city falling, but like an entire nation's spirit being crushed. It's a whole other level of tragedy.
And then we get King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, a name that still kind of makes you shiver, right? He lays siege to Jerusalem, and after a brutal fight, the city falls. The stories even describe, like, King Zedekiah's sons being executed right in front of him before they blinded him and took him prisoner.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim reminder of what war was like back then, even in ancient times. But the story doesn't end there. Nebuchadnezzar, maybe to make sure there wouldn't be any more rebellions, didn't just conquer Jerusalem, he destroyed the temple. That's like the holiest site in Judaism, and they turned it into rubble.
And here's where the history part crashes right into some really big theological questions.
Yeah.
God promised David an eternal dynasty, but then all this happens. The kings are gone, their capital is in ruins, even their temple's gone. So what happens to the covenant now? Is it broken? And if it is, What does that even mean for God's promises?
Those are some tough questions, and I bet they really weighed on those people in exile. And, there's still questions that make us think about faith, justice, and how God's plans can sometimes be, well, a little hard to predict.
I mean, it's hard to imagine, right? The people of Judah, they've just lost everything. Their king, their city, their temple, the thing that represented their whole covenant with God, it's just gone. Talk about a total upheaval of their world.
Oh, absolutely. And it's in times like that, times of real crisis, that you really see how people understand or maybe misunderstand their connection to God. Some people might have started to doubt if God was even powerful. Others might have thought he wasn't keeping his promises. And maybe some even wondered if they'd gotten it all wrong about what he expected from them in the first place.
I guess that's a pretty natural way to feel, isn't it? When bad things happen, we want to find someone or something to blame. But what I find interesting is that those biblical accounts, they don't try to avoid those hard questions. Instead, they kind of show us a different side of things, a more complicated perspective through the prophets.
Right. And Jeremiah, he's like the voice you got to listen to from that time. He saw everything that led up to the Babylonian exile. And what's really striking about him, he doesn't offer those easy answers, those like pat on the back, everything's going to be okay kind of answers. He really wrestles with the pain and the confusion that everyone's feeling, but he also manages to give this message of hope that comes right out of all that destruction.
So he's not like a prophet of doom and gloom, more like a spiritual guide for a time when everything's falling apart.
Yeah, exactly. And one of his biggest messages is this idea of a new covenant. Covenants weren't something totally new. You see hints of them in earlier texts, but Jeremiah, he takes it to a whole other level. He makes it this radical reimagining of how God and humanity relate to each other.
Okay, so let's break down this new covenant idea a bit. What makes it so different from that covenant that was made with David? And how does it connect to all this exile stuff?
Remember we were talking about the covenant with David, how it was all about an everlasting dynasty, a kingdom, with land and family lines and all that. Well, the new covenant, it shifts the focus, looks inward. It's all about changing the human heart, not just doing what the rules say on the outside.
So it's less about all those rituals and more about, like, getting in sync with God's will on the inside.
Exactly. Jeremiah even says this new covenant will be written on the hearts of the people. So it's a much deeper connection, more personal, something that goes beyond borders and even those earthly kingdoms we were talking about.
It's like hitting the reset button, spiritually speaking. And it seems like that would make a lot of sense given what's happening, right? They've lost their home, their temple, their sense of security, everything. So this new covenant, could it be like a way for them to find their faith again, even though they've lost so much?
Now, that's a good point. The Babylonian exile, yeah, it was devastating, but it also kind of created this opportunity. The Israelites had to re-examine, really think about their relationship with God. They had nothing left but the basics. And this heart-centered covenant, it gave them a way to reconnect with their faith, on a deeper, more personal level, even though they were in a foreign land.
It's funny, this idea of a new covenant, it kind of feels relevant even now.
Yeah.
I mean, look around. There are so many people searching for meaning, searching for a connection that goes deeper than like just the stuff we have, the surface level. Maybe this old idea can show us a way to find a better, more meaningful connection with something bigger than ourselves. Right?
That's an interesting thought, isn't it? It doesn't really matter if you're like part of a specific religion or not. This idea, this seeking change from within, like building this inner sanctuary where you can connect with what really matters to you, your hopes, your dreams, your values. There's something powerful about that.
Totally. And it just shows you, these old texts, they're not just some dusty old history books. They have wisdom in them, insights that we can still learn from today.
Absolutely. It's like we're having this conversation across like centuries, We're tapping into the experiences of those who had to figure out answers to some of the same questions we ask today. Questions about who we are, what our purpose is, how we deal with suffering and loss, all that stuff.
And speaking of suffering and loss, I'm curious, what was life really like for the Israelites during the exile? We've talked about all the big picture ideas, but what about the everyday stuff? What were they going through? What were they afraid of? What were they hoping for?
Well, just imagine it, being ripped away from your home, your family, and then forced to travel to this totally foreign land, a place where you don't know the language, the customs, anything. Even the landscape is different. If you read the Psalms, the writings of the prophets, you see all this lamenting, this grief, this longing to go back to the home they lost. It was a time of huge disorientation and trauma.
It makes me think about what happens today when people are forced to migrate, when they're displaced. War, persecution, climate change, it doesn't matter the reason. Having to leave your home, your community, it's a universal experience, a human one, that's been happening forever.
It's true. And these stories from the Bible about the exiles, they remind us that this is nothing new. This has been a part of human history for a really long time. But even in the middle of all that suffering, all that despair, you can see these little glimmers of hope, these amazing examples of how people are resilient, how they adapt.
Can you give us some examples of that resilience? How did they manage to hold on to their culture, their religion, when everything was so stacked against them?
Think about it. They didn't have the temple anymore. That was their central gathering place, right? So they had to come up with new ways to worship, new ways to connect with their faith, new ways to pass their traditions down to their kids, and that's exactly what they did.
So they had to get creative, right?
Yeah.
Necessity is the mother of invention and all that.
In a way, yeah. That's how we get the synagogue, a place for communal prayer, for studying, for interpreting those sacred texts. It was like a portable sanctuary, a way to keep Jewish identity and culture alive, even when they didn't have a specific place to call home.
That's so interesting. It's like they were rebuilding their spiritual world, even though their physical world had been completely destroyed.
Exactly. And this shift, to a more text-centered, community-based form of Judaism, it would have a huge impact on how the faith developed, on how we see it today.
So the exile was a time of terrible suffering, but it was also a time of huge change and growth. It really shaped the future of Judaism in some big ways. It just goes to show, even in the worst times, humans can be incredibly resilient and adaptable. But before we move on to talking about the legacy of the exiles, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of repentance. Was there a way for the Israelites to, fix their relationship with God? Could they come back from all of this?
That's the big question, and Jeremiah, he addresses it head on. He reminds everyone that even though they messed up, even though they strayed from the path, God's love and mercy are still there for them. But they have to genuinely want forgiveness, and they have to be willing to change their ways.
So it's not like you broke the covenant, game over.
No, not at all. Jeremiah makes it clear that repentance is the key. Admit what you did wrong, turn away from those bad behaviors, and try to get back in sync with God's will. And this idea of repenting and being restored, it offers a bit of hope during all that uncertainty of being in exile.
It's a powerful message, It says that even when we screw up, even when we're lost and feeling disconnected, there's still a way back, a way to fix what's broken.
For sure. And it reminds us that God's love isn't about being perfect. It's a love that accepts us even when we're broken, a love that offers forgiveness and a chance to start over.
A lot of people today, they can relate to that, don't you think? This idea that our past mistakes don't define us, that there are second chances out there, that we can always choose to heal and to start fresh.
It's a message that goes beyond culture, beyond religion. It's a universal message of hope and inspiration. And it speaks to the power of these stories, the ones we're exploring in this deep dive. They give us this glimpse into what it means to be human, with all the ups and downs, the good and the bad. And they remind us that even when things are rough, even when we feel like we're in exile, there's always a chance to find our way back home.
It's really interesting. The more we dig into these stories of exile and return, the more I realize they're not just ancient history. That they have these deep insights into what it means to be human. Our strength and our weaknesses, our desire for meaning and connection that need to find our way back when we're lost or hurting.
You're right, and that's what keeps these ancient texts alive, what keeps them relevant. They speak to something, universal in all of us, something that goes beyond time and culture.
For sure. We've talked about how the exiles affected individuals, how they forced them to really think about their beliefs, to grapple with these huge questions about their relationship with God. But what about the bigger picture? How did all this shape Judaism as a whole?
Well, you could say that the Babylonian exile, it was like a turning point, a before and after moment in Jewish history. The destruction of the temple, losing their homeland, those weren't just physical losses, right? They were these spiritual and cultural earthquakes that forced the Israelites to reconsider everything, who they were as a people, their covenant with God, how they could practice their faith without the physical stuff that had always defined it.
So it was a time of huge challenges, but also a time when they had to get creative, to adapt.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. No temple, no central place to focus on. So what happens? New forms of worship pop up, new religious practices. The Torah, which was, one part of their tradition, it takes center stage. Prayer, which used to be all about those temple rituals. It becomes more personal, something you can do anywhere. And all those communal gatherings that revolved around the temple festivals, they find a new home in the synagogue.
Ah, the synagogue. We mentioned it before, but it seems like such a crucial development. Can you tell us more about how it came about and what role it played for those communities in exile? How did it help them keep their faith and identity?
Okay, so picture this. You're an Israelite living in Babylon, far from home, missing all the rituals, the familiar structures that were always part of your religious life. You want to connect, right? You want to be with people who believe what you believe, study the Torah, pray, and find some peace, some meaning in all this mess.
I get it. It's that human need to belong, to have a purpose, especially when you've lost so much.
Exactly. And the synagogue, it came about because of that need. It wasn't meant to replace the temple, but it was a new way to express their faith. A way that was more, I don't know, adaptable. They could take it with them, it could work in different places, and it was more focused on studying and interpreting those sacred texts.
So it became a sort of spiritual center, a place to nurture their faith and their community while they didn't have the temple.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really cool is that the synagogue, which came about because of the exile, it ended up becoming a central part of Jewish life. Even after they went back to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple, the synagogue was still there.
That's a great example of how sometimes hard times can lead to new things, how loss can create space for new ways to connect and express ourselves.
Right. It shows how resilient people can be, how we can adapt and find meaning, even when things seem impossible.
So for our listener who might be wondering, okay, all this is fascinating, but what does it have to do with me? Why should I care about something that happened so long ago? What's the lasting impact of the exiles? How do they still matter today?
That's a good question, and I think there are a few ways to answer it. Theologically, the exiles changed how we understand God's justice and mercy, the importance of repentance, the idea that a covenant lasts. They gave us the concept of a new covenant, one written on our hearts, a closer, more personal relationship with God that goes beyond rituals and where you live. These ideas were huge for both Judaism and Christianity, shaping how people view God and their place in the world.
So this isn't just dusty old history. It's about ideas that are still alive, still influencing us today.
Absolutely. And culturally, well, the exiles led to the synagogue becoming this vital part of Jewish life. They also put a greater focus on the written Torah as, like, a guide, a source of authority. These changes have shaped Jewish identity and practices for thousands of years, influencing everything from religious ceremonies to ethics to cultural traditions.
So those exiles, they had this ripple effect that we still see today, both in religious communities and in the wider world.
No doubt. And one of the biggest takeaways, I think, is that the human spirit is powerful. We can adapt, we can create, we can find meaning even in the toughest times. Those Israelites in exile, they faced incredible hardship, but they never gave up. They were resilient, creative, and deeply committed to keeping their faith and identity alive. Their story is a source of inspiration for anyone who's ever felt lost, displaced, or cut off from their roots.
I like that. It's a great way to put it. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the exiles of Israel and Judah, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us, for taking us on this journey. And to our listener, we hope this is giving you a better understanding of what caused those exiles, what happened because of them, and why they still matter today. May their story of strength, repentance, and renewal inspire you on your own journey, your own search for faith and understanding. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.